We have a little video for you guys to watch in the while people are trickling in here, and this is about in December we had a Yale Life Sciences Pitch Fest. It was the first ever time that we did this event, and I think these guys back there can roll a little video about that while we're waiting for everybody else to come in. Guys back in the booth? Pitch Fest video? So you can hold the date. It's December 5th this year. I know it's 7 months away, but put it in your calendar. Oh, I hear something.
So I hope you've now all marked your calendars for December 5th for the Pitch Fest. It's a great event, and I'd like to just introduce myself quickly. I'm John Pusis. I'm Director of Business Development here at Yale Office of Cooperative Research, and it's my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker for the day, Sean Harper, who's a Managing Director at Westlake Village BioPartners, and his address is The Golden Age of Biotechnology. Sean was named by Time Magazine as one of the 50 most influential people in healthcare in 2018. He's helped bring over a dozen therapies to patients during his career. Prior to joining Westlake Village Partners, he was at Amgen from 2002 to 2018, where he became head of R&D in 2012. And in that role, he managed investment of more than $3.5 billion in R&D annually and brought numerous therapies to market. So without further ado, Sean.
Well, thank you very much. So, good afternoon, and it may seem a little bit odd for me to be up here talking about venture when I haven't spent the last quarter century working at large biopharma companies. And a lot of people ask me, and have asked me today, why would I give up such a great, secure job to go into such an uncertain sort of a business? And I think there are a number of reasons why I made this transition. And First and foremost, I would say that it is, in my view, the most exciting time in biotechnology history and human therapeutics history. The underlying science right now is exploding in a nonlinear fashion. And this presents us with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change the world for the better. And it's critical that we take advantage of this opportunity. The progress that we're seeing in biology today is just as dramatic as the progress that went on in physics and engineering in the 20th century. And that transformed life. My grandfather was born in 1900, and he didn't see an automobile till he was 13 years of age. By 1925, he was designing airplanes. And by 1950, he was chief of structural engineering at Douglas Aircraft Company. He led the design team for some of the world's first long-range passenger planes and oversaw the design of the Thor rocket, which was part of the US response to Sputnik. As a kid, 50 years ago, roughly, I was looking at all the models of planes and rockets and things in his home office. And I asked him how he got such an amazing job. It's really cool to a 6-year-old boy. And he said, if you want to change the world and do something really important, you need to work in a field where the underlying science and technology are exploding. And that's what's happening today. For him, the explosion was in physics and engineering. Today, the most explosive changes are happening in the life sciences. And the same thing that drew my grandfather to physics and engineering is in part what drew me to medicine and therapeutics development, in addition to my desire to help patients struggling with grievous diseases. When I was in medical school at UCSF, we had very few tools to address disease, and the AIDS epidemic was a particularly poignant example of this. We literally had no therapies available to treat the disease, and I watched a lot of people, otherwise healthy people, die. And I was struck by how much of a problem this is just generally. Now, we're talking about the early 1980s at this point. But in general, the number of really new important therapies that were available for disease were very limited. And over the course of my career, from becoming a physician to working in molecular biology laboratories and eventually leading a large biopharmaceutical R&D organization, I've noticed that the rate of biotechnology is advancing and actually accelerating in that advancement. And I like to call this the golden age of biotechnology. And it's the main reason that I moved from being in a large company R&D space into the venture capital space. Every industry has a moment when the underlying pillars of technology are advanced to the point where the speed of innovation and new discoveries is accelerating in a nonlinear or exponential fashion. And the question isn't when this will happen in life sciences, it is happening now. And the pace is accelerating at a rate that's actually difficult to comprehend, even for someone like myself who's been immersed in this world for such a long time. I think the real question we should be contemplating is, why is it happening now? And I believe there are three main revolutions that are driving this nonlinear explosion of the field. The first is the speed of relevant technological progress. So if you take as an example the sequencing of the human genome. Sequencing the first human genome in 2003 cost $2.7 billion all in. In 2008, it cost $10 million. And today, it's under $1,000. The technology allowing that cost decrease meant that we've been able to start the drug development and target discovery and validation process in many cases based on human genetic knowledge. And statistical, computing, and information storage technologies have evolved in parallel to make all of this possible. Whereas for years we've used mice and other model organisms as our substrate, now human biology is the substrate, and we're getting more comfortable using it as the primary source of insight. Imagine, actually studying humans to understand how to develop human therapeutics. Automation is another key element. when an industry undergoes automation, the speed, cost, and efficiency equation changes dramatically. Other industries have gone through this sort of revolution. We all have the evidence of that in our pockets. A cost of the first cell phone in 1983 was almost $4,000. In today's money, $10,000. Today, a new iPhone, which is essentially a supercomputer in 1980 standards, costs about $1,000. Those kinds of cost reductions and increases in speed in bringing new innovation to market are beginning to have a dramatic impact in biotechnology. A clear example of this in drug discovery and development is X-ray crystallography. When I was a postdoc at MIT, it took 10 years to solve a complex structure of just a single protein, let alone two proteins interacting or a protein interacting with a small molecule at atomic resolution. Today, large biopharma companies can solve 500 structures like this a year. Not only is our understanding of how to purify and crystallize proteins and then analyze the massive amounts of data improving, but robotic platforms have sped up the process exponentially. And now machine learning and AI are beginning to make meaningful contributions in these sort of highly technical areas. I believe these are right now overhyped a bit in general, but they do have specific application in this phase of drug discovery and development. I think they're going to have a transformative type of an effect over the next 5 and 10 years. Secondly, we have a much better understanding of human biology. These rapid technological advancements are allowing better understanding of human biology. We're able to leverage human biology to identify drug targets, and robotic automation and improved computational capabilities have brought a quantitative aspect to biology, which has historically been a pretty non-quantitative science. It's still not an engineering-based discipline where you can pretty much anticipate the result you're going to get when you make an intervention. However, we are moving away from pure empiricism to systems biology predictions with sufficient understanding to enable technologies like precision gene editing to achieve specific outcomes. Advances in our understanding of cellular biology are leading us to many new disease targets and insights. In the 1980s and 90s, a target biology revolution emerged from what we now consider to be classic cellular physiology and biochemistry. That helped us to develop drugs like histamine receptor antagonists, proton pump antagonists, statins, and ACE inhibitors. The big inflection points in our industry have occurred when there's a coincident target biology revolution and modality revolution that intersect. When that happens, you suddenly get a large number of breakthrough products. It happened in the 1990s, and it's happening again now at the intersection of having the human genome provide target discovery and validation and new modalities such as cellular and gene therapies. And it'll happen again in the future. It's just difficult to predict exactly how and when, but it will happen faster than any of us can imagine, because again, we're on a really nonlinear part of this innovation curve. We also have a much bigger toolkit available to address disease. And in the 80s and 90s, we went through a major modality revolution. This was the main incentive for me to move from Merck to Amgen, when it became possible to use therapeutic proteins to target disease in addition to small molecules. And while small molecule and antibody therapies are continuing to be refined and continue to be very powerful, the newer modalities open up opportunities to interdict unique targets to address medical needs in ways that simply couldn't be done before. We can now engineer more than a dozen different modalities to use as targets, to use as tools to interdict biological targets, and we're getting more precise with this all of the time. Regenerative cell therapies, nanoparticle delivery systems, gene therapy, viruses, CAR T cells, and nucleic acids are just some examples of new modalities that can overcome previously impenetrable barriers to treating disease. It's important to remember that the biotechnology industry alone is not responsible for this nonlinear progression and understanding of disease. A lot of what's fueling the curve in the US and certain other countries are huge investments in underlying university-based science and technology by entities such as the NIH, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and institutes like Yale. And of course, an institution like Yale can be an amazing strategic partner in our venture process. We also need to understand the value new medicines bring to society. Addressing serious unmet needs can save developed and developing countries billions of dollars potentially. Lost productivity, long-term care costs, hospital admissions are just some of the areas that new therapeutics can address, while at the same time improving the lives for millions of patients. Policymakers in society need to balance this value with the cost of new treatments. So I have some observations born of this transition that I made recently from head of R&D at a large biopharma to the venture world. It kind of brings fresh eyes to things. And one of the things I've noticed is people are very nervous about whether or not this is a biotech kind of a bubble. Is this sustainable? What's really going on? And I think that is unwarranted because of, again, the underlying technology and science that are going on in the field of biology are just accelerating in a way that has happened before in other fields. And I think if you understand that, you can begin to understand that this is not a blip. It's something that's going to sustain. And I think we're going to see more frequent, more important breakthroughs in meeting unmet medical needs that only really existed in the realm of science fiction in the past. At some point, the curve will flatten out, as we've seen in other industries, but we think that's decades away at Westlake Biopartners. If you go back 500 years and read what people were saying at the end of each century about science, they pretty much announce in every field of science that, well, we figured out everything important. And there's some incremental stuff that'll happen in the next century, and then we'll be done. And of course, that doesn't turn out to be true. John Maddox, one of the editors of Nature for many, many years, wrote a book about this, called The End of Science. And it is a remarkable way of thinking that I see all the time. But the truth is that that's not going to happen, and it's certainly not going to happen at this point in history in the field of biology and how biology translates into human therapeutics. I also get the question very pointedly, are we in some kind of bubble, and isn't this investing that you're doing in these startup companies going to all come kind of crashing down? And what I would say is that there are some features of a bubble right now from my perspective, but it's a little different than a tulip kind of bubble, because at the core of this explosion in biotech is very real value creation that I've kind of tried to depict here with that inner circle. The fundamentals in that circle are there, rapidly advancing science, aging demographics, increasing disease burden, and emerging middle class around the world, all intersecting with a capital-rich environment. And in that center circle, you have top quality science coming out of places like Yale. You have expert venture capitalists, expert talent that's being recruited into companies, and you're focused on real, true, unmet medical need. That sort of investment can thrive, I believe, through almost any market condition. However, outside of this center, in the sort of outer ring, there are indeed, in my view, less informed investors, less qualified company talent working on much more speculative science. And this does not always end well, and it is something to be concerned about. And obviously, somewhere out on the periphery of that universe are things like Theranos. So it is possible to get fooled and for people to lose a lot of money, and I think that's a very real possibility. It really depends on where you are in this universe. I also feel that from a sustainability perspective, emerging companies are going to continue to be a really important part of the ecosystem. I don't see large companies needing less of the kind of innovation VC-backed companies bring. In fact, a recent study that's indicated here shows that emerging biopharma companies now account for 3/4 of the new medicines that are in late-stage R&D, up from slightly over half 15 years ago. 3/4 of the medicines coming from this kind of innovation. And if you look at new drug launches today, 30% of them are coming from independent biotechs, and that's a threefold increase over a 4-year period. So I don't see the change that being an unsustainable component. And part of the reason is it's incredibly difficult at large companies to invest adequately in the kind of very early high-risk work that's done by venture funds like Westlake. It's very difficult because of all the competing pressures and priorities that you're placed under with late-stage clinical trials, regulatory requirements, safety requirements that are imposed on you randomly from around the globe by regulators, post-marketing surveillance, medical affairs activities that have to be done. Every time you launch a product, you've got to put a tremendous amount of R&D resource behind that product. Every time you enter a new country or expand operations in a new country, there's safety and regulatory people and all kinds of resources that, where does that resource come from when in general you look at the R&D expenditure from the large companies going down incrementally over time, right? That's not true of every company, but in general, because of the pressures that the industry is under, that's more or less what's going on. And there's also this phenomenon that, you know, if you try to convince people that you want to spend a bunch of P&L expense dollars on building a new, you know, gene therapy platform, let's say you wanted to do that, you know, 7, 8, 10 years ago, really hard to get people to agree that you should have some increase in the R&D expenditures carved out for that. It's take it away from other things. Well, as I just explained, that's really hard to do. But what you can do is if you come across a gene therapy company that's got a lead program and a technology platform that you can acquire from the balance sheet, you can at least take a shot at convincing everybody that we ought to buy this and you got to pay for the burn. We can't buy it and have no expenses to pay for the people and the programs. And sometimes the company will fund that. But to get them to fund that burn or any burn early without that acquisition trigger turns out to just be very difficult. So from my perspective, I see no way that this cycle of having a lot of the innovation coming out of the smaller companies is going to change in any foreseeable future. Large companies will continue to play a super important role in obviously, you know, commercializing the products and distributing to patients around the world. And I want to be clear, some companies like Amgen are still doing remarkably innovative internal drug discovery and development work. It's just not enough for what's required for the growth of these large companies in general. Another observation I have is there seems to be a kind of a feeding frenzy and herd mentality that I observe with fresh eyes on the venture community. There's certainly more capital coming in than there ever has been in the past, and a lot of it is coming from people who don't have the scientific understanding needed to distinguish a good idea from a bad idea or qualified people from unqualified people. And this gets compounded by this kind of following and herd mentality where investors seem to pour more and more money into an area in fear of sort of missing out and losing out on a wave of whatever it is, cell-based therapy for cancer, gene therapy for orphan diseases, and people begin to lose a lot of the sort of careful diligence orientation and start just trying to find a way to get their money into something. And I think anytime you see this kind of groupthink herd mentality, which I observe, for example, with the analysts, the 23-year-old analysts that follow my industry, they all, one of them would come up with an idea and they would all adopt it, and that was the dogma. And that's bad, always bad. And I see that going on quite a bit, and it's coupled in addition with throwing huge amounts of money at very small early stage opportunities. And that may seem like a good thing to do when you've raised big, huge funds and you've got to deploy your capital. But I'll tell you, from my vantage point, one of the most powerful things about these small companies is that they're scrappy. and they have to make do with less. They have to focus on their mission. There's an innovative environment that's very hard to replicate in a large company setting. It is really, really hard to produce that in a setting where people feel very comfortable with the capitalization of the company, which is true really for any large company in our industry. And you begin, in my view, to create an environment that can feel a lot like a large company, where there's plenty of money and there's plenty of time. And that's actually quite destructive, in my view, to the innovation culture that you want in these companies. So, our feeling is that you need to have a very strong alignment between science, the limited partners that are involved, the venture capitalists, and the entrepreneurs. And we tend to gravitate, for example, for our LPs to renowned and respected academic centers like Yale. This is terrific because if we deliver good returns, the value goes to a worthy cause at the university and ultimately helps to create more intellectual property. So it's a tremendous virtuous cycle. Before we head into the pitch sessions, I thought it might be useful to outline how Westlake builds successful startups. And I want to say that a lot of these ideas are thoughts that I developed with my partner, Beth Seidenberg, who's been a very successful life science investor now for about 15 years and couldn't attend the meeting today, unfortunately. So out of every 1,000 ideas that get pitched to VC, only about 3 or 4 get funded in life sciences, and even fewer of them become successful businesses, let alone give the kind of venture returns that many of our LPs are looking for. And our objective, of course, is to increase the odds of having that kind of positive outcome by providing deep technical and business expertise to our partners. So, how do we go about doing that? And I'd say we use really first a solid foundation with 3 key factors. First, it has to be a transformative technology or product candidate or candidates that address a high unmet medical need. Everybody says this, but you get a lot of compromises around it often. There's a lot of incrementalism going on out there, and it's not that it's not something that might work, but is it really transformative? Because I think right now the pace and the competition environment is such that you really have to be looking for things that are transformative. Secondly, you've got to have a CEO, entrepreneur, or founder who has real vision and passion for what they're doing. And if you don't have that, you better find somebody to plug into that role. And you need a solid intellectual property base as a foundation to build on. Another observation I have from sort of fresh eyes is I'm seeing a lot of investment going into things where it's pretty clear from the diligence that we do anyway, from an IP perspective, that the work is going to violate people's IP. And sometimes the view is that the IP won't stand challenge. But other times it's just, I'll sort that out later. I think as investors, we need to recognize how important the intellectual property landscape and architecture is for this industry. This is an IP-based industry. There is no way this industry can exist without people respecting intellectual property. Relationships in the VC world are key, and one of the key decisions we make as early-stage investors is to decide who our co-investors are. It's really critical to have alignment. This is something Beth taught me early on. Misalignment regarding strategy, funding approaches, expectations can lead to suboptimal outcomes for the company and for investments. In terms of entrepreneurs, they say it's lonely at the top, and this is really true. And a good venture capitalist should be the first person that a CEO calls when they have a question, a problem, or just need advice. It's a long-term relationship we try to foster over time to ensure success, and we try to hopefully work repeatedly with people over the years. We believe VC firms should have a deep expertise in drug discovery and development, capital management and allocation, and an outstanding network of CEO candidates, scientists, business executives, in such a way that the collective team should be additive to what an entrepreneur can bring to the table. Life science venture capital is a technical profession. It's not just about doing diligence and sourcing investments. VCs should have the experience to understand the technical aspects of product development and how to build a life science company. And really choosing what to invest in is only the beginning. I think the real work is helping the entrepreneurs build a great company. This is actually very hard to do, and it takes expertise that's only gained by years of experience. In particular, we've found that the translation of basic science and preclinical data to human proof of concept testing is the most interesting phase of drug discovery and development, and this is what Westlake focuses on. All of us in the investment group have had a lot of experience doing this sort of work. And it is one of the hardest phases of product development with quite a high failure rate. It's sometimes referred to as the valley of death in the drug discovery development phase. So having extensive experience and success in this phase of product development in your investing partner can improve the probability of success. And of course, positive proof of concept data, even very early in small numbers of patients, can be the major value inflection point for all shareholders. So as I've said, I think venture capital is kind of a helping partnership type of profession. Therefore, every day we start with determining how we can help the entrepreneurs we back. We try to provide all kinds of resources, people, technical advice, judgment, counseling, research reports, and recruiting. The most important part of our philosophy is to be by the side of our entrepreneurs all the time through good and bad. It really is, to an extent, like a marriage. And there are bumps in the road. And when that happens, we become problem solvers. And we roll up our sleeves and we help entrepreneurs deal with them. There's nothing that's too detailed or too technical for us to get involved and try to help with. We stand by them rather than moving our capital to another investment. Every company is going to have its ups and downs. Every drug that I saw make it to market was killed by the commercial group or somebody declared it dead at least 7 times before it made it to the market. It was usually a very strong indicator that we should continue to focus on the project, by the way. It's easy to be supportive of entrepreneurs when things are going well, right? It's lonely and difficult for the CEO when things are not going well. And that's why when we try to have the most impact by being supportive. Another aspect is the risk tolerance. There's no coincidence that risk capital, venture capital are synonymous in some people's minds. And one of the key things about being an early stage investor is that we have to be comfortable with risk. We're the ones who should be willing to take risks earlier and be willing to be more forward-looking than a large company would be. Our job is to see around the corner and ask ourselves, what will this therapeutic area and technology be like 3 to 5 years from now? And again, that's kind of an experience-based intuition. Biology is very complex and not always predictable, so it's really important to have plan B to make sure that when things are not going according to plan A, you don't keep just funding and hoping for a different result. But instead, you're willing to say, look, it just was too early or too hard. And while you still have some money in the bank, move on to plan B. It's really important to recognize that failure is not a failed company. It's maybe a failed idea, technology, or molecule. And you should keep going with plan B unless you've got real problems with the team. But not all CEOs actually have the temperament to let go or, in their minds, give up. And this is one of the things we discuss with our CEOs from the beginning as a key point of alignment, because this idea of having a plan B and pivoting if the technology doesn't work is, I think, a really critical factor in having a much higher success rate in the end of the companies that you incubate. Occasionally, things do go awry due to the CEO's inability to see the problem and lead the organization through the problem. And sometimes the job of the venture capitalist and the company board is to facilitate a smooth transition to a new leader. Never easy. So we take the long view. It's about developing great products and companies. And we feel that if we do that well, we'll do financially well, and our LPs will do well. Have a passion for what you're working on and be mission-driven. Choose your investing partners wisely and make sure that you and your investors have clear alignment on vision, philosophy, and goals. Communicate bad news faster than good news, and ask for help rather than trying to solve all the problems yourself. You don't have all the answers, nobody does. So I believe this is the golden age of biotechnology. We're at an inflection point where the pace of change is accelerating incredibly rapidly. As my grandfather said to me almost 50 years ago, if you want to change the world, you have to work in a field where the underlying science is exploding. Biotechnology holds the promise to do what has never been done before, help people live longer, healthier lives, free of disease. We have an unprecedented opportunity to change the world, and I think the time is now. Thanks, and I look forward to hearing the cutting-edge ideas in the pitch sessions. I'm happy to take some questions.
Happening in Russia and China in these same areas now?
Yeah, well, I think that in both of those kinds of countries, there is, of course, a very strong heritage of underlying strong, science in various disciplines. And certainly in China, you see a very organized effort by the government to try and focus, on biotechnology in a very big way. What I would say is that I think the innovation potential from those countries is still fairly low in comparison to the United States or the UK or Germany, et cetera. I don't think it's going to stay that way forever. But I think there are issues in these countries that prevent a lot of the innovation from actually arising from the basic science environment. There are issues, with the educational system. There are issues with the political systems and other things that make me tend to be a little bit cautious interacting with things from both of those. I've had bad experiences personally with things from both of those countries in particular, in terms of probity and being able to count on things being that are said to you being actually true. And that's just a personal experience. I'm not making a broad generalization about people from those countries. I'm just saying that, I've had some pretty bad experiences, and so it's made me be very careful.
I have a question about diagnostics. So accurate and early diagnostic of cancer is... Hi, my name is Ken Hu. I have a question about diagnostics. So early and accurate diagnosis of cancer is, in our view, of course biased, the most important. However, VCs and many investors are not very fond of diagnostic and medical devices. Is this run, and how do we change that? They always ask, who's going to pay, and are you insurance and all that.
Yeah.
But when something is right, when something is must, isn't it venture capital's a job or your mission to support us to correct what is wrong?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I guess what I would say is that what I believe is going to happen in the diagnostics, I'm not going to try to address both diagnostics and devices, but just focus on diagnostics. I think what we'll see with diagnostics, as has already occurred to an extent in areas like oncology and infectious diseases, is that when the diagnostics have clear value in choosing who to treat, and perhaps things like how much drug to give to the patient to avoid side effects, et cetera, they will be incorporated essentially into the therapeutics as part of a package. And right now, the payment systems are all screwed up in a way where, at least in the US, where a drug, but what we've seen is that over time, if you, for example, look at something like RAS testing for EGFR antibodies, or there's a lot of examples, but that's what, the testing gets done. Now, it doesn't get done everywhere, but it generally gets done. And one of the big problems is that, for example, I've gone through this process innumerable times where we develop a companion diagnostic, and we have to actually pay the diagnostic company to develop the diagnostic for us so that we can get registered with the companion diagnostic, because they know that they're not going to ever make any money on the test. We know that it's going to be done homebrew by all the academic medical centers and that there'll be a very small market for it. But the regulatory requirement is that we have something that's an approved, FDA approved or CE marked kit. So you have to kind of go through this dance to get this. And it puts the whole therapeutics program at risk, because if your partner doesn't have the diagnostic ready in time, guess what? You can't get your product approved. So it isn't a good system right now. And I think that as soon as it's possible to demonstrate that you can, in the end, it's got to be value-based. As soon as you get to a point where you can say, hey, you shouldn't be treating people for hepatitis C if they don't have hepatitis C infection. You got to establish that they have hepatitis C infection, right? We don't treat just everybody that has a tattoo thinking, well, maybe they have hepatitis C. So ultimately, we're going to have to have a very clear value equation that says that it's expensive and harmful to the healthcare system to use a therapeutic without the diagnostic. Or that, for example, the costs of care and the ability to actually cure someone because you detected their cancer early from a liquid biopsy is a proven thing. People will pay for it, right? I mean, people are going to pay for things that save money in the long run. Now, the problem we face today, just to be clear, is that you go outside the United States and everybody has that mentality, and it's the right mentality. They take the long view. They recognize that they should make these investments for long term, but they want to pay like $1.95 for it. Whereas you come in the US and people are willing to pay a high price for the therapy, but they don't want to be the ones to pay for it. So what you find is, of course, everybody agreed that the cost effectiveness of hepatitis C therapy was there. But outside the United States, people want to pay a very, very low price for that. They'd love to give it to all the patients that need it, but they want to pay a very, very low price for it that's problematic for companies. And in the US, the price is very high, and everyone's like, well, I'm not going to be the one that's going to pay to cure this person of hepatitis C. Wait till they change healthcare plans, or wait till they go on Medicare, or wait till they get out of jail, because then they can get treated for hepatitis C on someone else's dime. So we've got some pretty fundamental problems in our system that have to be sorted out. And, that's a societal issue we face. Great. Well, thank you very much.